James Miller never imagined that a single Saturday would change everything. At 68, he lived quietly in a small Ohio apartment, carrying the quiet weight of losing his wife, Martha, 3 years earlier. His daughter, Emily Miller, was the one bright light in his life, though her marriage to Bradley Thompson had tied her to a world James never belonged to. Bradley's parents, Palmer and Serenity Thompson, were wealthy, polished, and cold, and they made no secret of considering James unworthy of their circle. That morning, the phone rang with an unexpected call. Bradley, who rarely spoke to him directly, said in a clipped, formal tone that Emily insisted he invite James to Serenity's grand birthday dinner at the Worthington Hills Country Club. James knew the Thompsons didn't want him there, but for Emily's sake, he agreed. He put aside his newspaper, poured out his cold coffee, and began preparing to face an evening he already dreaded as he looked through his old closet for something decent to wear and worried about bringing a modest gift. James felt the gap between his modest life and the Thompsons' glittering world grow heavier. Still, he reminded himself he wasn't going for them. He was going for Emily, the daughter who still looked at him with love and pride. Even when others saw only a man they could dismiss, James Miller spent most of that afternoon preparing for the birthday dinner, ironing an old navy blue shirt that still carried faint creases from years of wear. It wasn't much compared to the designer suits he knew he would face at the Worthington Hills Country Club, but it was the best he had. He tucked a small silver picture frame he had bought at the department store into a gift bag, hoping it would pass as thoughtful rather than inadequate. He told himself again, "I'm not going for them. I'm going for Emily." The drive toward Dublin, Ohio, felt long, not just in miles but in weight. James had rehearsed polite answers for the inevitable questions from the Thompsons about his work, his life, and his place in their world. He knew they'd never let him forget that he was a retired mechanic with oil-stained hands and a modest pension. But he also knew that Emily would be there and she wanted him present. That mattered more than any cold stare Serenity Thompson could throw his way. About an hour into the drive, James spotted a car pulled over on the shoulder of Interstate 70. A sleek silver Mercedes sat lifeless, hazard lights blinking in the afternoon sun. Most drivers sped past without a glance, but James's instinct was immediate. Years under the hood of broken down, cars had trained him to recognize trouble when he saw it. Pulling his old Toyota Camry behind the stranded car, he stepped out and approached. A woman in her mid-60s stood beside the open hood, her silver hair perfectly styled, her navy blazer a sharp contrast to the grease-stained engine. She looked relieved but cautious as he drew near. "Car trouble?" James asked, keeping his voice calm and steady. "Yes," she said, her voice carrying the clipped elegance of someone used to boardrooms and polished conversations. "The engine just died, and all the warning lights came on." James introduced himself. "I'm James Miller, used to be a mechanic. Mind if I take a look?" After a moment's hesitation, she extended her hand. "Lauren Whitmore. And yes, I'd appreciate any help you can offer." James rolled up his sleeves and got to work, diagnosing a failed water pump and a shredded belt. It wasn't an easy roadside fix, but he had carried spare parts and tools in his trunk for years. As traffic roared past them, Lauren watched with growing respect as James worked steadily, his hands blackened with grease, his shirt gradually collecting stains that would be impossible to hide later that evening. Over 2 hours passed as James improvised a solution. Installing a rebuilt alternator he had kept just in case, and tightening bolts with the practiced confidence of a man who had lived his whole life fixing what others left broken. While he worked, they talked. Lauren shared that she had been widowed 5 years earlier, losing her husband to cancer. James nodded quietly, telling her about Martha, about the silence of his mornings, about how grief never truly left it, only changed its shape. "People don't often stop anymore," Lauren said softly, watching him work. "They'd rather call roadside assistance and move on with their day." "Most people don't know how to fix what breaks," James replied, his voice low but firm. "I do, and if I can help, I will." When the engine finally roared back to life, Lauren clapped her hands together in relief. "James, this is incredible. How much do I owe you?" "Nothing," he said, wiping his hands on an old rag. Sometimes, people just need help. That's enough. She stared at him, astonished. At least let me pay you for the part. $15 at a junkyard, he said with a shrug. Not worth arguing over. Lauren smiled genuinely warmly, the kind of smile James hadn't seen in years. Then at least give me your number. People like you are rare. I'd like to stay in touch. James hesitated, then nodded, punching her number into his old flip phone. For the first time that day, he felt a glimmer of something he hadn't felt in years: connection, respect, maybe even friendship, as he pulled back onto the highway. His hands still stained with grease, he glanced at the dashboard clock. He was catastrophically late for Serenity Thompson's birthday dinner. His shirt was ruined, his gift bag crumpled, and his appearance nowhere near business casual. He knew that Thompsons would sneer, maybe even humiliate him in front of their polished guests, but James couldn't bring himself to regret stopping. For once, he felt like he had been exactly where he was supposed to be, helping someone who needed him. And what he didn't know yet was that this one act of kindness on a busy Ohio highway would change the entire course of the UHR evening. His life by the time James Miller turned onto the winding streets of Worthington Hills. The sun was dipping low, painting the manicured lawns in gold. Every house looked like something out of a glossy magazine, brick colonials with bay windows, fountains in the yards, and luxury cars polished to mere shine. James's old Toyota Camry, with its fading paint and rattling muffler, looked like it had wandered into the wrong neighborhood. He parked behind a row of BMWs, Autis, and a black Cadillac Escalade, all gleaming like badges of belonging. On the SDO's passenger seat sat the gift bag with the silver frame inside. The ribbon handles were wilted from the heat, the tissue paper crumpled. James sighed. It wasn't much, but it was what he could give. He caught his reflection in the shiny door of a Lexus and winced. Once neatly pressed, was now streaked with grease from the roadside repair. No matter how much he had scrubbed his hands with wipes, dark smudges remained under his nails. His hair was windblown, his collar askew. Business casual? Not even close. Still, he squared his shoulders. He was here for Emily, not for Serenity and Palmer Thompson's approval. The doorbell chimed with a polished classical tune. Serenity herself opened the door. She was dressed to perfection in a cream-colored suit, pearls around her neck. Moment her eyes landed on James, her expression shifted, surprise, disapproval. Then a look that made James feel like dirt tracked in from the street. "James," she said flatly, taking the gift bag from his hand with just her fingertips as if it might stain her manicured nails. "You're late." "Car trouble on the highway," James explained, forcing calm into his voice. "I stopped to help." "I see." Her tone suggested she saw far more than he wished. She stepped aside reluctantly. "Bradley, your guest has arrived. Guest, not family." Inside, the foyer sparkled with marble floors and a chandelier dripping with crystal. Voices and laughter spilled from the living room, but as James entered, the sound dimmed. Palmer Thompson stood near the fireplace, his broad frame imposing in a tailored suit. His eyes swept over James, pausing at the grease stains on his shirt. "There. You are," Palmer said, the words in accusation. "We were beginning to wonder if something had happened." "Something did happen," James replied. "Someone needed help." "Of course," Palmer muttered, his mouth twisting. Bradley appeared, wine glass in hand, his tie perfectly knotted. "Well, you made it," he said without enthusiasm. Then, like a ray of light in the icy room, Emily rushed forward. "Dad!" she cried, hugging him tightly despite his disheveled state. "I was so worried." "I'm fine, sweetheart," James assured her softly. "Just a little dirty, that's all." But Serenity's lips pressed thin, her voice sharp. "Perhaps you'd like to freshen up. We have a powder room." "He's fine as he is," Palmer cut in, his words blunt as a hammer. "Let's not pretend this is anything other than what it is." "Palmer," Emily pleaded, her cheeks flushing. "Asterisk what?" Palmer barked. "We are entertaining business associates tonight, and he shows up looking like he crawled out from under a car. While we're supposed to maintain standards, the word standards landed like a stone in James's chest. Around them, conversations in the living room stuttered to a halt. Guests sipped their wine slowly, trying not to stare, but their eyes lingered all the same. Emily stepped in front of her father, her voice trembling. He was helping someone whose car broke down. That's who he is. He helps people. Exactly the problem, Serenity said with a smile sharp enough to cut glass. Some people don't understand appropriate boundaries. Palmer's voice boomed across the room. Either change into something civilized or go home. Can't afford a display like this at our celebration. The air turned heavy, silence filling every corner of the elegant room. James could feel every eye on him, weighing, judging. He thought of Lauren Whitmore on the highway, her gratitude, her warmth, the way she had called him a decent man. Now here he was, being told by his own family's in-laws that he wasn't fit to sit at their table. He straightened slowly, dignity stiffening his spine. "You're right," he said quietly, his voice carrying more weight than he expected. "Some people don't understand boundaries. Some people think money makes them better than others." Gasps fluttered through the room. Serenity's face went red. Palmer's jaw tightened. And Bradley shifted uncomfortably, but James didn't stop. "Character isn't for sale," he said firmly. "You can dress it up in suits and marble floors, but it shows itself when nobody's watching." Emily's eyes brimmed with tears. "Dad, please." James touched her shoulder gently. "Sweetheart, you deserve better than this." With that, he turned toward the door. The birthday roast, the crystal glasses, the towering cake hit, all faded behind him. He was leaving with the only thing that mattered intact, his dignity. But as his hand reached for the doorknob, the chime of the doorbell rang out again. Classical notes echoed through the tense silence. Through the frosted glass panels, James saw a familiar silhouette, silver Mercedes parked in the driveway, elegant heels clicking on the stone walkway. Lauren Whitmore had arrived, and in that instant, James realized the night was far from over. The air inside the Thompson house hung, heavy, thick with embarrassment and unspoken judgment. James Miller had nearly reached the front door when the bell chimed again, filling the marble foyer with its polished classical notes. Every head turned. Through the glass panels, James caught a glimpse of a familiar shape: silver hair, navy, blazer, confident stride. His heart gave a jolt. Lauren Whitmore, the very woman who's broken down. Mercedes he had spent 2 hours repairing on the shoulder of Interstate 70 now stood on the Thompsons' doorstep. And the realization crashed down. This was the important guest the family had been waiting for. Bradley scrambled forward, nearly spilling his wine as Palmer's face drained of color. Serenity, usually so controlled, seemed to freeze in. The door opened, and Lauren stepped inside with calm elegance, her heels clicking softly against the marble. Her eyes swept the room before landing on James. "James," she exclaimed warmly, her voice carrying through the silence like a hymn in a church. "What a wonderful surprise to see you here." The room collectively inhaled. Guests shifted, eyebrows raised, glasses paused midair. Nobody had expected this refined, powerful woman to recognize James, let alone greet him like an old friend. James felt the tension in his chest ease as he allowed himself a small, Lauren smile. "Lauren, small world, isn't it just?" she replied, her face lighting up as though they had been friends for years. "How did the rest of your drive go? Hope you weren't too late for your family gathering." The Thompsons stood in stunned silence, their earlier contempt unraveling before their guest's eyes. Serenity's lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. Palmer's grip on his glass tightened, his knuckles pale. Bradley's jaw worked, but nothing emerged except a nervous swallow. This is your family gathering?" Lauren asked, her eyes moving from James to the room, her brows lifting in quiet surprise. James nodded. "That's right." Lauren turned back toward the hosts, her expression polite but probing. "Well, what are the odds? The man who spent his afternoon getting my Mercedes back on the road turns out to be part of this celebration." The guests erupted in whispers. Palmer stepped forward, his voice straining for control. "Mrs. Whitmore, we are so honored to have you join us for Serenity's birthday. Truly, It's a privilege. Lauren gave him a gracious smile, though her eyes held steel. The pleasure is mine. Though I must say, she let her gaze sweep the room again. I seem to have walked into a rather tense atmosphere. Serenity rushed to smooth things over, her voice high and brittle. Not at all. We were just welcoming James. How fortunate he could join us, but Lauren wasn't. Fooled. She tilted her head slightly, studying Serenity with a kind of polite dissection. Welcoming him. It's not quite what I overheard. Her eyes softened as she looked back at James. This man spent over 2 hours under the hood of my car. This afternoon refused to take a penny for his work. Without him, I wouldn't even be here tonight. You mean to tell me, her voice hardened, that you mocked him for showing up late and dirty? The room froze. No one dared move. Palmer cleared his throat, desperation creeping into his tone. Mrs. Whitmore, surely you understand. We maintain certain standards here. Standards? Lauren repeated the word slowly, like a teacher, examining a poor student's answer. Your standard is to humiliate a man for showing kindness. To treat him as less than human because his shirt has grease on it? No one spoke. Even the background music seemed to have gone silent. Lauren stepped closer to James, her presence like a shield. Let me be perfectly clear, she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. Either James is treated with the dignity and respect he deserves, or I leave this party immediately. And believe me, I don't make idle threats. Gasps echoed. Guests exchanged glances, sensing the balance of power shift entirely. The Thompsons, who prided themselves on control, were suddenly cornered in their own mansion. Serenity's face had gone pale. Palmer's jaw clenched, but his eyes betrayed panic. Bradley looked like a man watching his entire future slip away. In real time, finally Palmer forced a smile that looked more like a grimace. Of course, James is welcome at our table. Lauren gave a short nod, her voice cool. Good. Then let's enjoy this evening properly. She turned to James with genuine warmth. James, would you sit beside me? I'd much prefer the company of someone with real character. James hesitated, glancing at Emily. She gave him a tearful, grateful smile, silently urging him forward, and so James found himself walking back into the lion's den this time, not as a target of ridicule, but as a man shielded by the most powerful person in the room. For the first time that evening, the Thompsons weren't in control. The tension around the Thompson dining table felt as heavy as the chandelier overhead. Forks scraped plates, glasses clinked faintly, but no one dared speak too loudly. James Miller sat beside Lauren Whitmore, trying to shrink into the chair even as every guest's eyes kept drifting toward him. The Thompsons had gone from smug hosts to desperate performers, struggling to hide their panic beneath forced smiles. Palmer, usually so commanding, couldn't stop fidgeting with his silverware. Serenity carved the roast with surgical precision, her hands tight on the knife. Bradley's wine glass trembled each time he raised it to his lips. And Emily's sweet Emily sat across from her father, trying to bridge the chasm between two worlds with polite conversation about weather and local events, her eyes darting toward him with quiet reassurance. Lauren, however, looked perfectly at ease. She spoke with James as though they were old friends, asking him about his years as a mechanic, about Martha, about the small pleasures of everyday life that money couldn't buy. Her attention was genuine, her laughter unforced. Each time she leaned toward him, James felt the sting of humiliation ease, replaced with something he hadn't expected to feel that night: dignity. But the mask of civility cracked when Palmer, in an effort to regain control, turned the conversation to business. Mrs. Whitmore, he said for the third time that evening, his voice straining for steadiness, we are truly honored to have you here. Your reputation in the investment community precedes you. At those words, the room stilled. James's fork paused halfway to his mouth. Investment community. Lauren set down her wine glass with deliberate care. Does it now? She asked, her tone gracious but edged. Palmer rushed ahead, oblivious to the trap. Of course. When we heard you were reviewing Thompson Construction's proposal, the expansion project for the new commercial development. Well, we couldn't have been more excited. The words landed like thunder in James's ears. So this was why they had fawned over Lauren's arrival, why they had hosted this grand display of wealth. Lauren wasn't just another socialite. She was the potential investor, the one person who could make or break Palmer's empire. Asterisk. And she had just spent her afternoon on the side of I-70, watching James crawl under her Mercedes, using his own tools and parts to put her back on the road. Lauren's eyes sharpened. Interesting, she said coolly. Because tonight has been quite educational. A nervous ripple moved around the table. Palmer's face blanched. Serenity's knife slipped against the roast, nearly cutting her hand. Bradley cleared his throat, but no words came out. Lauren continued, her voice calm but carrying to every guest. You see, when I consider an investment, I don't just look at financial projections or market trends. I evaluate people. Character, their integrity. How they treat others when they believe no one important is watching. She turned slightly, her gaze moving over the Thompsons like a spotlight. And tonight, I watched how you treated James. The room froze. Not a fork clinked, not a whisper stirred. You told him he wasn't fit to sit with human beings, Lauren said, her voice gaining weight. You humiliated him for arriving late, when the reason he was late was because he spent over 2 hours helping me, a complete stranger on the side of the highway. Without him, I would not even be here tonight. Gasps rippled from the guests. Emily's eyes welled with tears, pride and relief shining through them. Palmer stammered, We didn't know that, Lauren interrupted, is precisely the point. You didn't know? Your true selves. Her words hung like a gavel strike in a courtroom. Serenity tried to recover, her voice trembling. We were simply maintaining appropriate standards. Lauren's laugh was soft but sharp as glass. Standards? A standard that demeans kindness and elevates cruelty? That's no standard at all. That's arrogance. She turned back to James, her expression warm, protective. This man embodies values I cherish: decency, humility, service to others. And you chose to ridicule him in front of your guests? James lowered his gaze, humbled by her defense. For years he had endured being looked down upon by the Thompsons, but now the tables had turned. He wasn't the one under judgment anymore, they were. Lauren straightened in her chair, her voice steady. I will not be investing in Thompson Construction. God, in good conscience, support people who lack the most basic human decency. Money can build structures, but only character builds trust. I do not trust you. The words landed like hammer blows. Palmer's face drained of all color. Serenity's lips trembled. Bradley looked like a man who's carefully constructed. Future had collapsed in an instant. Around the table, guests stared wide-eyed, realizing they had just witnessed the Thompsons' empire crumble in real time. James felt something shift inside him. Lightness he hadn't felt since Martha passed. It wasn't triumph exactly, but the satisfaction of seeing truth brought into the open, of watching arrogance meet its reckoning. He reached for Emily's hand across the table. She squeezed it tightly, tears slipping down her cheek, whispering, Dad, I'm so proud of you. And for the first time in years, James believed her. That night, long after the birthday party had ended in humiliation for the Thompsons, James Miller returned to his small apartment. The silence felt different this time, not the empty ache of widowhood, but a kind of calm after a storm. For the first time in years, he hadn't been the one made small. The people who tried to crush him had been exposed, not by anything he'd said, but by their own cruelty. Yet James wasn't naive. He knew people like Palmer and Serenity Thompson didn't forget being embarrassed, especially in front of their wealthy friends. They would look for ways to strike back, to reassert control over Emily, over Bradley, and over him. He couldn't sit idle and hope it would blow over. He had to prepare. He sat at his worn oak kitchen table, pulled a yellow notepad from the drawer, and drew 3 neat columns across the page. At the top he wrote, what they know, what they don't, what I want them to think. It was something. Martha used to say back when they handled tight finances together, clarity is power. James needed clarity now more than ever. In the first column he listed what the Thompsons knew, that he lived alone in a modest apartment, that his finances were limited, that Emily was his one soft spot. In the second column, he listed what they didn't know: the small savings Martha had tucked away in separate accounts, the life insurance she had left for Emily, and the fact that his late wife had quietly paid off their old mortgage years before she died. And in the third column, he wrote what he wanted them to believe: that he was harmless, predictable, and willing to stay in his corner. But James knew better. He had to stay one step ahead. The next morning, he drove to the post office and opened a small P.O. box. If the Thompsons ever tried to interfere with his mail, they'd find only an empty apartment mailbox. From there, he stopped at the bank. To make sure Martha's separate accounts were still untouched, the balances weren't enormous, but they were steady.
Had enough to give Emily some protection if the Thompsons ever tried to manipulate her through money.
James also called an old friend from his church, a semi-retired lawyer named Peter Alvarez. Peter had helped him once after Martha's funeral with paperwork, and James trusted him. Over coffee at a quiet diner, James laid out the situation, not the drama of the dinner, but the facts of how the Thompsons had treated Emily and how they might try to push him aside legally. Peter listened carefully, nodding. "You've done the right thing getting ahead of this. I can draw up a cease and desist if they try to meddle in your affairs. And if you want, I can check the paperwork on Martha's accounts, make sure everything is airtight."
That's
"Exactly what I need," James said, relief washing through him. For years he'd been reactive, just surviving each jab from Serenity and Palmer. Now he was finally playing offense. That afternoon, James took another step that gave him quiet satisfaction. He bought a refundable one-way ticket to Florida, nothing more than a placeholder. He had no intention of fleeing yet, but just knowing he had the option to walk away on his own terms made him feel lighter. Freedom wasn't about running, it was about choice. Back at home, James packed a small duffel bag and set it by the bedroom door, not because he planned to leave immediately, but as a reminder he wasn't trapped. He had options. He even began sorting through boxes in the closet, dividing things into neat piles labeled go, stay, travel. That evening, James pulled out his cell phone and scrolled to Lauren Whitmore's contact. Her name glowed on the screen like an unexpected lifeline. He didn't call. He wasn't ready for that. But just knowing he could made him smile. In the span of a single day, he had gone from being scorned by the wealthy to being defended by a woman who understood what real character meant. He glanced at the notepad again, the 3 columns still clear in his careful handwriting. What they know, what they don't. What I want them to think. For the first time since Martha's passing, James felt like he was no longer drifting. He was steering his own ship, small as it was, through waters that had once seemed impossible. The Thompsons thought they could humiliate him, then forget him. But James Miller had no intention of being forgotten. 2 weeks passed after that disastrous birthday dinner, and James Miller thought perhaps the storm had quieted. He had returned to his routines, morning coffee, reading the sports section. The quiet hum of his modest apartment, yet underneath the ordinary rhythm, he felt the tension waiting. The Thompsons were not people who let go of a slight, and the humiliation Lauren Whitmore had dealt them still lingered like a wound they could not hide. The knock came one gray Tuesday morning. James opened the door to find not just his daughter, Emily, and son-in-law Bradley, but also a sharp-looking man in a tailored suit carrying a leather briefcase. Bradley's expression was stiff, Emily's eyes were downcast, and the stranger introduced himself with a cool handshake. "Mr. Miller," the lawyer said smoothly, "I'm Daniel Price. The Thompsons asked me to facilitate a conversation about your future." James didn't miss the choice of words. Facilitate meant pressure, and your future meant their control. "Come in," James said, stepping aside. His voice was calm, though his pulse ticked faster. He gestured toward the worn sofa, and they sat, Bradley stiffly crossing his legs, while Emily perched on the edge of the cushion. Price opened his briefcase and laid out a stack of documents. "As you know, Mr. Miller, you're living alone in a property that, frankly, may be too much for one man to maintain. The Thompsons are concerned about your well-being and believe it would be wise to consider alternatives. Assisted living arrangements, perhaps, or selling your assets to secure a more sustainable lifestyle." James leaned back in his chair, folding his hands. He could hear Palmer's voice behind every word, an attempt to package control as concern. My life may not meet your definition of sustainable, James said evenly, but it suits me just fine. Bradley shifted uncomfortably. James, this is just about being practical. You're retired. You don't need the burden of Emily. Cut in softly. Dad, they just want to make sure you're safe. Her voice carried more hesitation than conviction. James looked at her, seeing the conflict in her eyes, the daughter torn. Between loyalty to her father and pressure from her husband's family, he turned back to Price. I appreciate the concern. But let's be clear. My affairs are in order. My home is mine. And I don't require management from the Thompsons or anyone else. Price's polite smile faltered. Mr. Miller, refusing to plan responsibly could cause unnecessary complications. For your family down the road, James felt the anger rise, but kept his voice steady. The complications come when people who don't own my life try to run it. Bradley flushed, his jaw tightening. This isn't about control, James. It's about common sense. You can't live like this forever. James leaned forward now, his tone firm. Bradley, let me make something very clear. I am not a resource to be managed. I'm a man who's lived a full life, who buried his wife with dignity, who raised a daughter the best way he knew how. I don't need a committee to decide where I live or how I spend my days. Emily's eyes filled with tears, but James pressed on, his voice calm and resolute. But you're here today to convince me too. Hand over control of my future, you're wasting your time. The silence stretched. Price shuffled his papers, realizing the meeting wasn't going as smoothly as his clients had hoped. Bradley looked frustrated, Emily heartbroken. Finally, James stood, signaling the conversation was over. I will continue to live on my own terms. You're welcome in my life as family, but not as wardens. If the Thompsons have further concerns, they can bring them to my lawyer, Peter Alvarez. He'll be glad to remind them of the boundaries. That name landed like a warning shot. Price blinked, closing his briefcase without further argument. Bradley rose stiffly, muttering something under his breath, while Emily lingered at the door, her eyes pleading. Dad, she whispered, I don't want to lose you in all of this. James touched her shoulder gently. You won't. Not unless you let them decide who you are. Remember, Emily, you don't have to live by their standards. You have a choice. She nodded through tears, and then they were gone. What? The apartment was silent once more. James sat back down at his table, staring at the notepad with his 3 columns. What they know, what they don't, what I want them to think today. He had drawn a line they could not cross, and for the first time in years he felt not just defensive, but strong. A week later, a thick envelope arrived in James Miller's new P.O. box. The return address read Lisbon and Alvarez, attorneys at law. He carried it back to his apartment with steady hands, though his heart hammered like it hadn't in years. Inside, neatly bound documents confirmed what Peter Alvarez had hinted at over coffee. Martha had left more than memories behind. Years earlier, without telling even him, she had worked with an overseas law office to secure ownership of a small villa in Florida, something she'd bought quietly with money saved from an inheritance James never knew she'd received. The paperwork was airtight, its title and her name, transferred fully to James after her passing. For a long time, he just sat at the kitchen table staring at the deed. Martha, in her quiet wisdom, had given him not just a home, but a choice, backup. Plan if Emily's in-laws ever tried to strip him of dignity or stability. She knew, James thought, his throat tightening. She knew they'd come for me one day. She made sure I'd have a way out. The realization both comforted and saddened him. He could almost hear Martha's voice urging him to stay strong, too. Guard what mattered, to never let arrogance define his worth. That night, James pulled out boxes from the closet and began sorting. He labeled 3 piles on the floor with index cards: go, stay, travel. Minutes ago went his daughter Emily's old belongings she'd left behind after marrying Bradley. Photo albums, childhood trophies, books she'd once loved and to stay. Went his most cherished possessions: Martha's wedding ring, their family Bible, framed photos of their years together. Into travel went only the essentials: clothes, documents, the carefully folded deed to the villa. The process was slow, deliberate, almost ceremonial. It felt less like packing and more like reclaiming his life from the shadows of other people's control. 2 days later, he called a moving service. By the end of the week, boxers marked with Emily's and Bradley's names were delivered to their suburban home. James included a handwritten note with each: returning what belongs to you, keeping what belongs to me. When the delivery truck pulled away, James stood at his window, watching it disappear down the street. I felt no bitterness, only clarity. The Thompsons had always treated him as a burden. By sending back every trace of their things, he made it clear he was not theirs to manage. Not a man waiting quietly in the corner for scraps of dignity. That evening, his phone buzzed. A text from Emily: "Dad, the boxers came," at least furious. "He says you're being selfish." "I don't know what to say." James typed slowly, carefully: "Sweetheart, I'm not being selfish. I'm drawing boundaries. Don't confuse the two." He set the phone down and poured himself a cup of coffee. Outside, the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple. For the first time in years, James didn't feel weighed down by what others expected of him. He felt lighter, freer, as if Martha herself had lifted a hand from beyond to guide him. On the table, his notepad still lay open, the 3 columns filled with scribbles and notes. In the margin, he wrote one more line in firm handwriting: "Return what isn't mine. Protect what is." The Thompsons would rage, he knew. Bradley would call him stubborn, Palmer would sneer, Serenity would twist her mouth into that thin line of disdain. But it no longer mattered. James had made his choice. He had honored Martha's foresight, and he had quietly prepared the path for whatever came next. When he turned off the kitchen light that night, the apartment no longer felt small or lonely.
Out.
It felt like a fortress, not of walls and locks, but of resolve. James Miller wasn't just surviving anymore. He was taking control. The confrontation came sooner than James Miller expected. It was a humid Saturday afternoon when a hard knock rattled his apartment door. James set down his coffee and opened it to find Bradley Thompson standing there, jaw clenched, eyes flashing with barely contained anger. Behind him, Emily lingered near the stairwell, her hands wrung tight, her face pale with worry. "James," Bradley snapped, stepping into the apartment without waiting for an invitation. "We need to talk. Now." James closed the door calmly, his posture steady. "Then talk," he said, his voice low and even. Bradley paced across the small living room, his polished shoes clicking against the old linoleum. "Those boxes you sent, what were you thinking? Shipping all of Emily's things back, dumping them on our porch like some kind of statement. Do you realize how selfish that looked?" James folded his arms, his expression unreadable. "It wasn't selfish. It was clear. I returned what belonged to you, and I kept what belongs to me. That's all." Bradley let out a bitter laugh. "That's all. You embarrassed us in front of the delivery crew, in front of our neighbors. Do you have any idea what people are saying? You made it look like we'd abandoned you, like we didn't care about your Bradley." James's voice cut through, his rant calm but sharp. "I don't live my life to protect your reputation. If appearances matter more to you than people, that's your problem, not mine." Emily stepped forward then, her voice trembling. "Dad, please. Bradley just feels blindsided. He doesn't understand." James softened his gaze toward her, but his tone remained firm. "Sweetheart, I don't need him to understand. I need him to respect boundaries. If he can't, then we don't have anything to discuss." Bradley's face reddened. He slammed his hand against the back of a chair. "Boundaries? You've got nothing to protect, James. You live in a rundown apartment clinging to scraps, yet you act like you're some kind of king holding court. You're not. You're a lonely old man with nothing but pride keeping you alive." Words landed like stones, but James didn't flinch. He let the silence stretch, then answered with measured calm. "You're right about one thing, Bradley. I don't know what you value: money, status, influence. I have something you'll never understand: self-respect. I know who I am. I know what I've built with my own 2 hands. And I don't need to grovel for approval from anyone. Bradley blinked, thrown off by the steadiness in James's tone. His anger had been a weapon, but it seemed to slide uselessly off James's calm resolve. You think this is strength? Bradley demanded. Walking away, cutting ties, making everything harder for Emily? You're not protecting her, you're isolating yourself? James shook his head slowly.
No.
I'm showing her that a person doesn't have to bend just because someone wealthy or powerful demands it. I'm showing her that dignity matters more than comfort. Emily's tears spilled then, her voice breaking. Dad, please, I just want peace between you. James placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. Peace doesn't come from silence, Emily. It comes from truth. And the truth is, your husband's family tried to break me. I won't let them. Not now, not ever. Bradley's jaw worked furiously, but he found no words. Finally, with a sharp exhale, he grabbed his jacket and stormed toward the door. You'll regret this, he muttered, slamming it behind him so hard the walls rattled. The apartment fell quiet again. Emily lingered, torn between loyalty to her father and her marriage. James pulled her into a hug, holding her as he whispered, You're better than this storm. Don't let their bitterness become yours. She sobbed softly against his chest, nodding. I'm trying, Dad. I really am. James kissed the top of her head. That's all you can do. Try. And remember, love doesn't mean surrendering who you are. When she left, James sat back down at his kitchen table. The air was still heavy with Bradley's anger, but James felt no regret. He glanced at the notepad with its 3 columns. The strategy still held. Bradley had tried to rattle him, to paint him as weak and selfish. But James had discovered something. In himself he hadn't known he still possessed, the ability to stay calm in the face of cruelty, to hold firm when others tried to strip him bare. He smiled faintly as he sipped his cooled coffee. For once he wasn't the one retreating from a fight, he was standing tall. After Bradley's angry visit, James Miller knew the worst of the storm had passed. The Thompsons had played their hand and he had not folded. For the first time in years, James felt not like a burden to be managed, but a man who had taken back control of his life. A week later, a final set of documents arrived confirming what Peter Alvarez had already told him. The Florida villa was fully his, transferred by Martha with careful foresight. He traced her signature on the old deed, his chest tightening with both grief and gratitude. Even in death, Martha was still protecting him, still reminding him to stand tall against the world's cruelties. James began clearing out the last pieces of clutter from his apartment. In one box, he packed clothing he no longer needed. In another, he placed worn tools, polished from years of labor, choosing only a few to take along just in case. The process was quiet, almost sacred, returning each object to its place, deciding what would follow him into this next chapter. And then he made one final gesture. The last of Emily and Bradley's belongings, small mementos, and household items they had stored with him were shipped back with a simple handwritten note, returning what belongs to you, keeping what belongs to me. This time, there was no confrontation, just silence. The message had been received. That evening, James sat on his porch with a glass of iced tea, watching the Ohio sunset bleed orange across the horizon. His phone buzzed. A text from Lauren Whitmore. Dinner soon? Somewhere without chandeliers or marble floors? James chuckled, typing back, Absolutely. I know just the place. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and leaned against the railing, breathing in the evening air. For the first time since Martha's death, the world felt open again, not empty, open. The Thompsons had tried to strip him of dignity, to reduce him to a man they could control. Instead, their cruelty had forced him to rediscover his strength, his independence, and the quiet satisfaction of choosing his own path. Emily would be all right, he knew it. She carried his kindness, even while caught in the storm of her husband's family. And as for Bradley and his parents, their downfall was already set in motion. Wealth might insulate them for a while, but true character had a way of revealing itself. James poured himself another glass of tea, lifted it. slightly toward the sky and whispered, "Thank you, Martha, for teaching me how to stand." My friends, there comes a point in life when we all must decide, do we let others define our worth, or do we claim it for ourselves? James's story reminds us that dignity cannot be bought, sold, or taken. It can only be surrendered. And when you refuse to surrender it, you find a strength you didn't know you had. For those of you listening, especially if you've ever felt dismissed or underestimated, remember this. You are not what others say you are. You are the sum of your choices, your kindness, your character, and that is priceless. If this story moved you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below. Have you ever faced a moment where you've had to stand up for your dignity? And if you'd like more stories like this, full of heart, courage, and lessons for life, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Together, we'll keep reminding each other of what really matters.